And get started now. All right, hi everyone. My name is Julia Maeta. We are so pleased that you all could join us for this week's lecture, bringing you experts from around the world in neuropsychology. This neuropsychology didactic series was created by trainees and early career neuropsychologists to provide free, high-quality didactic opportunities. If I could get a next slide. We would like to thank our sponsors for their financial support of this series. Next slide. Our disclaimers are here for the series and they can be found in full on our website. Next slide. Questions for our speakers can be submitted via the Q&A box on the lower left of your screen, and we will be recording today's lecture to provide on our website later this week. Next slide. Now it is my pleasure to welcome Josh Fox-Fuller, who will moderate today's panel. Josh is a rising fourth-year student in the clinical psychology doctoral program at Boston University. In addition to his service on the No Neuropsychology Committee, Josh also serves as a member at large for the International Neuropsychological Society, or INS's Student Liaison Committee. Now I'll let Josh take it away for today's talk.
All right, thanks so much, Julia, and thanks everybody for joining us today. I'm really pleased to be welcoming you today to our panel entitled No Neuropsychology Around the World, or No Neuropsychology Around the World. We're having speakers today coming to you from Europe, Grenada in the West Indies, Canada, and Latin America, who will be speaking about the profession of neuropsychology in their respective countries. So now it's my pleasure today to welcome Dr. Natalia Ojeda, who's a full professor at the University of Deusto in Spain, to speak to us about neuropsychology in Spain. She's been an active researcher for the past 25 years, looking at research across a variety of psychiatric and neurological disorders. And today she'll be talking to us about neuropsychology in Spain. So Dr. Ojeda, go ahead and take it away.
Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you for this opportunity and for putting this panel together. I think it's an excellent idea, and I hope you all enjoy, and at the end of the day, we can learn more together about how neuropsychology is around the world. To start, I have to say, just for clarification, that although I'm linked and I am associated to several professional societies in neuropsychology, not only in Spain, but in Europe and across the world, today's presentation is based mainly in my experience and the information I have access to, meaning that it does not represent any official perspective from any of those organizations. Thank you. First slide. So some of the questions that can be addressed today are how training is for to become a neuropsychologist in Spain, and what's the path to become either neuropsychologist or psychologist in Spain. And this is a huge, big question, because I have to start saying that in Spain, the only branch of psychology that is officially recognized by our government and the educational system is just clinical psychology. So neuropsychology is not recognized as an official branch of psychology, only clinical psychology is. And there are mainly two ways to become a clinical neuropsychologist in Spain. One of the main ones is to become to join a residency program, an official residency program that are basically run by the public hospitals and the public health system in Spain. And that's about the main health quality health system offered in Spain. All citizens in Spain have the right to full access to the health system, to the public health system, which is acknowledged as one of the best quality health systems in Europe. And So clinical psychology residential official programs are joined to the public health system. And if you want to become a clinical psychologist working in a public health hospital, you actually have to join one of those programs. The problem mainly is that to join one of those programs, the number of applications is really high in Spain. For example, last year was up to 200 applications, whereas only about 1/3 of those numbers are available in terms of real access to the program and system for getting training. That means that most others clinical psychologists candidates go through the programs that are available at the universities across the country, which are mainly master level programs. And some of the universities, either public or private universities, have actually now programs at the master level to become recognized as a neuropsychologist, but any student going through that path is going to become a neuropsychologist recognized by the educational system, but will not have access to any employee position at the public health system. So neuropsychologists who have been trained at the master level program at any of those universities will have access to any private institutions, health institutions, and also to private practice, of course. As I said, the health system in Spain, about 85% of the population is joined and uses the public health system on regular basis. And only about between 25 or 35% of the population, depending on the area in Spain, have also hired a private contract with a private company to have a coverage by any private health insurance. And this situation has started changing a little bit in the last maybe 10 years, so that more and more people are actually hiring private health insurance overall. But this is still kind of, reduced and partially available. Historically, it is interesting to know that in the early 80s, only 2, 3, maybe 4 people were practicing something that could call or could be named as neuropsychology in our country, I would say. And believe it or not, as it happened in many other countries that I know of, the first ones in practicing neuropsychology in either the public health system or the private health system were mainly MDs, mainly neurologists for the most part. And they were also the first ones in our country in developing norms for some of the most well-known test neuropsychological tools or test materials. So when I came back from United States in Spain, and this was the middle 90s, it was very hard, and I had to myself to explain other colleagues in psychology, in neurology, in psychiatry, and other fields that what a neuropsychologist was for and what was our type of work and the main contributions that we were able to make. So it was soon in the 90s that I had to go literally, physically to hospitals to explain, to provide presentations. And this situation rapidly changed, not because of myself, but fortunately because of everybody's work and other colleagues' work that were doing the same type of work in different provinces in Spain. That I have to say that in the early 2000, 2005, the situation totally, completely changed. So everybody, of course, knew from then on what a neuropsychologist was doing, which type of work we were able to do, and which type of contributions we were able to make. Most of the neuropsychologists in the 90s were linked to universities and to research labs, mainly in Spain. And only in the maybe in the last 5 years or so, some of the neuropsychologists have been hired as neuropsychologists or clinical neuropsychologists in the main public health system hospitals. And that's very interesting. It's a very interesting change for the field, because, as I said, the public health system is the most powerful one. It's very prestige because has a really high quality, but it was not until 5 years ago that the first neuropsychologists were recognized in the public system as such. And there are very few still. I've been unable to compile how many in total they are, but in my impression is that no more than 10 in the whole country, which is very, very few. Some of the clinical psychologists who are working in the main hospitals in the public system have contributed as well as one of the specialties is in neuropsychology while they are being trained, meaning that while they are doing their training to become a clinical psychologist as a trainee or in their residential programs, they can choose mainly 4 different options to get specialized, and neuropsychology is now one of those 4. So slowly in the 90s, a little bit more up in the early 2000s, and totally, I would say, totally developed field nowadays, although with difficulties accessing to public health system positions. In terms of resources for training, those are mainly focused on university, in the university system, and a little bit also accessible through the professional societies. Spain is made of 48 provinces, and nowadays each province has their own professional society in neuropsychology, and the 48 together join what we call the Federation of the Spanish Societies in Neuropsychology. This federation offers at least one annual congress every month of March, and each individual society, regional society, offers usually also training for students or for professionals who want to increase their knowledge in neuropsychology. Most of those seminars and meetings are usually not for free, but students usually have a very reduced fee, very reasonable fee compared to university fees. Next, please. The interaction with the medical profession is, for the most part, very nice. In my own experience, I have to say that probably MDs, if there is any specialty in psychology that the MDs show respect for, this is neuropsychology. I think they have recognized the contributions, they know the role that we are doing and we can do, and they search and ask about our work to be present and to be recognized. I've been working for 25 years with neurologists and psychiatrists mainly, and I feel myself recognized and respected by all of them. The interaction is also very nice with radiologists when we do imaging work, brain imaging work, and also with geriatrics when working in the dementia field. And, you know, other specialties in the medical profession are not so, probably there is no much connection with neuropsychology for many other ones. But those main ones in the neurology is psychiatrists, geriatrics are probably the main ones, and radiologists as well. Although radiologists in Spain are not medical by themselves, they don't have to be, they are not requested to be MDs. But the professional collaborations are very nice, and also we are invited to present and to contribute with research work and with clinical work during their official meetings as well. Next, please. When we address the barriers or the challenges in our country at the moment, I will say that the main one for the last years have been being recognized as a specialty from the educational system, from the Ministry of Education. Any other recognition by a master level university degree or certification is not official in our country. And you know, also because we belong to Europe, and I think today I'm the only one from Europe presenting, I have to say as well, because this is interesting, that it's very challenging to get organized within Europe and to agree on a common system for all the European degrees to be recognized at the same level. Basically, in Europe, what is happening is that the European Union has supported and has agreed and encouraged all the governments in Europe to become together and to have titles, specialties and degrees that can be equivalent among the whole European system. However, this is very challenging because the starting point for each country was quite different, and that's the case as well for neuropsychology. United Kingdom, which is going out Europe now, but for years had a very established and well-defined system to become a neuropsychologist, or countries also like German. But in Spain, as I said, the situation is quite different. So one of the questions is, should a master level degree be recognized by all European countries as a degree or accreditation that will allow any neuropsychologist to move along from one country to the other, to be recognized and to be hired, or to have the option to occupy a situation, a role as clinical neuropsychologist in any of those countries? That's a big question and a big challenge. And also, you know, in the last 15 years, people from many different countries have arrived, not only to Europe, but specifically to Spain. The level of immigration has increased in percentage that are not official. It's hard to find official numbers for that, but the immigration in Spain is basically from three main areas geographically. This is Latin American countries, Eastern Europe, European countries, and Northern Africa countries. And that's a real challenge, because when I arrived to Spain in the early 90s, the norms for materials, for test materials, were not demographically based on the Spanish population. And the only norms that we had accessible were the ones available from UK or from US and Canada. And that's of course, that was a great limitation at the moment. And we made many efforts, many different teams, research teams, academic teams, made a great effort in assessing and testing large samples of normal population in Spain to put together norms for most of the well-standardized neuropsych tests that we use in clinical practice. However, those norms were based mainly on Spanish-born Spaniards, and not people who came from different cultures, different languages, and were not born or raised and not access to the educational system in our country. So when today having to face the situation of testing any of these people, these persons, there is a huge limitation accessing proper norms or even proper materials, just neuropsych tools in their languages, in their adjusted system. So that's another great barrier or challenge to face. Next, please. And just to give you a very brief idea, in Spain, there are 4 official languages. Castellano or Spanish is the main language, but we also have Galicia, Gallego, then we have Euskera in the Basque country, we have Catalan in Catalonia, and some people claim that Valenciano in Valencia should be recognized as an official language as well. And I have to say that even though I have not been trained in Catalan or Gallego, I can understand mainly what the main message of a person speaking those languages. But usually the Basque language is a very real challenge itself, because it's totally different, has nothing to do with any Latin language, and has nothing to do with the Spanish language itself. And just I will take the opportunity to say thank you for listening, but also to say gracias and eskerrik asko in Basque, and to give you a little detail about how different words can be in the official languages in our country. And imagine the challenge to be assessing people who have been born and raised in speaking Basque, whereas their knowledge in Spanish might be quite limited sometimes. So I'll be taking questions at any time where Joshua and other colleagues say so. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ojeda, so much. I really appreciate that discussion about the multicultural issues around immigration that you're facing in Spain. We will take questions and answers at the end of the entire panel, which is 4 presentations. So the last 15 or 20 minutes, we'll go ahead and do those questions and answers. So if you have a question for Dr. Ojeda, please submit it to our chat box or to the question and answer box. So our next 2 presenters actually are Dr. Karen Blackman and Kemi Bergen, who will be speaking about their experiences with neuropsychology in Grenada, the West Indies. Dr. Blackman is currently a clinical neuropsychologist at the Mayo Clinic in Jacksonville, Florida. She completed her PhD in psychology at the New School for Social Research in New York, and her 2-year postdoctoral fellowship in clinical neuropsychology at the New York University Comprehensive Epilepsy Center. She has spent the past several years involved in capacity building of neuropsychological research and practice in Grenada, the West Indies, as part of a research grant there where they studied the effects of prenatal arbovirus exposure on neurodevelopment. And during her time there, she was a faculty member in the Master's in Clinical and Community Psychology program at St. George's University, which is where Kemi Bergen, one of her former students, actually got her Master's in Clinical and Community Psychology now. So Kemi Bergen is a practicing clinical and community psychologist in Grenada, and the 2 of them will be speaking today about their experiences in this country. Go ahead and take it away.
Great, thank you, Josh, and thank you to all the organizers of this fantastic event and for letting us speak to some of the really exciting efforts that are going on in the Southern Caribbean to build capacity for neuropsychological assessment. So I'll be sharing this platform with Kemi Bergen. She's really leading the efforts going forward because this is a very new effort. So when we talk about training for neuropsychology, we're really talking about training to become a psychologist in the Caribbean because there is no path yet for neuropsychology. So really by the end of this, I hope that you understand some of the work that's been being done to build capacity and to bridge and fill that gap. So in the Caribbean, and I'll speak really to the English-speaking Caribbean, so Martinique, Guadeloupe, part of France, and so really the training will be more European there, and not so much speaking to Spanish-speaking Caribbean. So these are really the Southern and Eastern Caribbean, Grenada, Trinidad, Tobago, Jamaica, St. Lucia, St. Vincent. And there, the path to become a psychologist is similar to the European model in that it's a master's level training. There are several programs across the English-speaking Caribbean and to offer a bachelor's degree in psychology, but really only 2 programs that offer a master's degree, one of which is at the University of West Indies in Jamaica, in Mona. And that one I'm not so familiar with, so I won't speak as much. I do know that one of the professors there, Michael Lambert, he is doing some really excellent work in developing a Caribbean symptom inventory to characterize psychopathology in the more Caribbean specific idioms and domains. So he's doing great work, and he's actually at the University of North Carolina social work program in Chapel Hill. But I'll spend more time talking about the master's degree in clinical and community psychology, in which Kemi's a graduate and in which I taught, and is really a newer program. I think now it's just graduated its 2nd cohort. It's a 2-year master's degree. And if you'll notice, it says clinical and community, and that's purposeful. It's intentional because the program was developed by a group of psychologists who got together, and this was really spearheaded by Arlette Harry, who's currently the director of the program, and Dr. Emeleru Marshall, Omowale Emeleru Marshall, who is from Guyana, and wanted to see more of an emphasis in training on indigenous Caribbean models of behavioral change. And that when I say that, I should let Kemi speak a little bit more because it's a bit outside of my domain. I'm trained in the US, but the idea there is instead of just importing models of individual behavioral change to really enlist the models of community change and how that can support individual change. So Kemi, if you wanted to speak a little bit more to the emphasis in that program and what makes it unique from potentially other European or US programs.
Yes, okay, that's no problem. I could speak a little bit about that. Well, I did not attend any schooling in the US or the UK, so I'm not particularly knowledgeable about that experience. But for me, this program was a bit different because it was really focused on this type of indigenous psychology. So they really, the persons in charge made a huge effort to make sure that we understood the importance of culture and not just about taking psychology in its original form and downloading it to the Caribbean. So they really wanted to instill in us the importance of understanding the importance of our Caribbean history and our Caribbean culture while we were doing this master's degree. So it was very different from what you may have learned about in terms of traditional psychology, where in every single class that we did, there was an element of understanding how this is suited to our people and how it could be suited to our culture. So it wasn't just about, the traditional psychology in its most traditional sense, but it was about understanding the importance of making sure that we can actually reach our people with it. One of the issues that we have in the Caribbean right now with psychology is that it's now really getting, I wouldn't say popular, but I think people are getting more accustomed to the idea of psychology and therapy and all of that, even neuropsych assessment. That's not something that when I was growing up or even when I was getting into schooling in the Caribbean, many people would ask, well, what are you going to do with that? Why would you do a degree in psychology? But you see that now that things are really changing. And I think that it's definitely important that we who are now about to be the game changers and are about to be the reason why psychology in the Caribbean is a thing, we understand that, we can't just take something wholesale and bring it and enforce it on people who don't understand that. We have to make it something that they can understand and something that they can welcome before we can really reach who needs to be targeted. And so I think the important thing about that program too was the elements of community psychology, because it's a way that you get to look at preventative measures and things that are very important to us in the Caribbean. So that's really my take on the clinical and community psych program that I was a part of in Grenada. Yeah.
Kemi's done a lot of work to continue. She's part of the Grenada Psychological Association, which holds regular meetings to highlight people in the field, efforts that they're doing, bring people together, and professional development and training, along with other Caribbean resources. The Windward Islands Research and Education Foundation, I'll talk more about, because it's really been an important part of capacity building and bringing grants into the region to train students in assessment and implement large-scale research programs. Another thing I want to point out is that SGU, which is St. George's University, hosts visiting professors, which is another key bridge to well, the US, really in Europe, in terms of bringing in training, expertise, so that students can, yes, build up from within, but at the same time with a bridge to the outside. So moving forward to think about the next slide, to think more about how does capacity building work then? Okay, so you have a country where there's very little resource, especially in neuropsychology. So the few neuropsychologists that are there, I'll highlight Barbara Landon, who was trained in the US as a neuropsychologist and is now the director of the Psychological Services Center at the med school. So SGU is an American medical school in Grenada. And she had identified a real problem in the community in terms of corporal punishment and violence in the home that was leading to higher rates of psychopathology and cognitive disorders in children. And at the same time, I was coming in studying arbovirus exposure, so the impact of prenatal Zika, and other researchers were looking at chikungunya exposure and dengue exposure in the region. And we all have the same problem is, okay, how do we assess development then? We need to look at outcomes. What are outcome measures and how are we going to develop those? So we attract grants to bring money in to then bring expertise in to train students within the master's program to administer neurodevelopmental assessments. And that's been a really key part of capacity building. So attracting funding and training students so that they can continue to not be engaged in the research, but also as practitioners in the region. So we have had specialists come in, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in terms of neurodevelopmental assessment. Michelle Fernandez developed a 1-year-old and a 2-year-old neurodevelopmental test battery, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. But that students were trained in this and then could again administer in the community and to children. So it's giving students exposure and training as well as community exposure to become more familiar with this type of assessment paradigm. And another thing I want to mention is that within the master's program at SGU, there's real strong, as Kemi was talking about, a strong understanding of culture and the cultural limitations of testing. So with every measure that's given, there is intense debate. Is this appropriate and will this work? And another important point of capacity building is involvement of the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Health and Social Development. So Grenada has a nationalized healthcare program. And so for psychologists to even practice in the region, there has to be long-term buy-in from the different ministries. So one way in which that occurred is the Ministry of Health, let's say, would have they're part of our grants. So we always involve them, and they would actually disseminate research findings to the public. The Ministry of Education would have teachers, guidance counselors go through the master's program so that there's this intense communication and link between the ministry and through SGU and through the development of this master's program. The next slide. So in terms of the child development assessment packages, I want to highlight this particular package because it shows that how this can be done, and in my opinion, the way it should be done in terms of assessment, culturally informed and appropriate assessment. So Michelle Fernandez and her team, they were part of the Intergrowth 21 project, which was a global project to assess healthy, educated mothers across the world and look at prenatal as well as postnatal development. And Michelle Fernandez was tasked with creating a developmental outcomes assessment at 1 year and 2 years. And the assessment package they created had to, one of the goals was to create something that would work across many different cultures. And so the package was normed in Brazil, India, Kenya, the UK, and Italy. And they published a really interesting paper that showed across all countries, if you equate for socioeconomic status, for education and the mothers, and they've done deep phenotyping of the mothers, you'll find that the scores varied little between countries. So there's very little variance between countries, which is what you would want in a measure to show that there were no strong cultural effects. So this was the measure we implemented to assess development in children who were exposed prenatally to Zika, chikungunya, or dengue. And over here on the right, you can see Kemi administering one of the visual assessment batteries. This is the Cardiff visual contrast sensitivity tests. So the child is pointing at one of the, if the visual object is either on the top or the bottom of the screen. So let me go to the next slide, please. And I just want to show some other, this is the part of the executive functioning measure in the neurodevelopmental test battery where Rashid is assessing problem solving.
Right, good job.
Great, and then it also includes assessment of fine motor skills. That one seems like it might be frozen there. So students are going into the clinics and assessing children, and they're also part of the research project and finding, so on papers and helping with data analysis. So that is an important part of capacity building. So next slide. We can go on to the next slide if possible. Is everything frozen?
I think we might just be having a technical challenge.
Okay, well, in the meantime, speaking of challenges, Kemi, do you want to discuss some of the some of the challenges going forward? So when it comes to, again, capacity building, one thing to keep in mind is that referral sources haven't necessarily been identified yet. There's no, there's no reimbursement schedules. There's nothing really in place yet. So this is truly in the early stages. So we have cohorts of children who've now been assessed and become used to this whole paradigm of being in a room, having another person give them a bunch of tasks. And the parents are also becoming accustomed to this whole model. It's of course a research effort, so it's somewhat limited in that there are currently no norms available to give parents meaningful feedback, which is a challenge. But so one of the big efforts that Kemi has been involved in is developing a local measure to be able to assess learning and memory in children, because some of the existing measures, as people know, the NEPSIs, if you've ever given it, has a face battery that's a little bit limited for children from Grenada because none of the children look like them. So one of the members of our research team is an artist and drew pictures of children to be able to do face name binding. And the master's program students developed a verbal memory task where children are asked to go to the shop and remember what they're supposed to buy. So there are currently efforts, Kemi is part of that effort now, to norm this test in Grenada in hundreds of school children. And we can move forward to the next slide. So some of the most important lessons that we've learned is that it's very critical to involve all the multiple stakeholders from the beginning to be able to develop a test that meet the local needs. One big need is that at this point in the Grenada school system, children aren't necessarily identified as having reading disability or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And so one of the areas that have been identified as an important growing area by the Ministry of Education is to be able to assess children, to pull out children who do have special needs. But then what do we do with those children? So there's currently limitations in terms of allied health services. There's only one speech pathologist on the island to be able to work with children. Kemi, do you want to speak to some of the other limitations?
Yeah, okay, so in terms of that, like some of the issues that we've had in that case would be pertaining to the testing sites is one of the big issues that we've had, because we sometimes have to do the assessments in the schools. This is in relation to the projects that we're currently doing in collaboration with UNICEF to basically map the development of children between 3 to 5 in Grenada. And so when we do those assessments, we do them in the schools, but not all schools actually have a space or a place where we can actually do those assessments in a quiet place that allows for a good testing environment. So there are some schools where we may have to do the assessments outside, like in the yard or in the playground or in a room right next to a classroom where you can hear children. And sometimes things like this happen where you would be doing an assessment and then the other kids, because they're all 3 to 5 years old, other kids will come and peep and try to see what you're doing and, things like that. So it is a bit of a challenge in terms of the testing site. That's one of the challenges that we have. Some of the challenges that I guess you may have spoken to a bit earlier, Dr. Blackman, were things like the language and the cultural barriers. So when we do assessments like the NEPSI, some of the tests are not exactly culturally sensitive in that some of the items may be things that kids may not have been exposed to in Grenada and things like that. So I guess those are your standard limitations in assessments like that, especially since we don't really have any norms just yet. That's something that's now kind of being worked on with this mapping that we're doing for 3 to 5 years old. But that's, again, only one test, one age group. So there's so much more work that needs to be done when it comes to neuropsychology in the Caribbean in general, and in particular in Grenada.
The last slide. And
Yes.
just to speak to that, so Kemi is part of this organization for Eastern Caribbean states and their efforts to standardize assessments, which poses a lot of challenge in terms of regional dialects, but she's a part of that effort. And maybe, Kemi, you could speak a little bit also to the efforts for the Ministry of Health to develop these standardized school assessments.
Yes. Okay. So one of the things that we have been trying to do, and a lot of these efforts are through WINDREF, which is the Windward Islands Research and Education Foundation, located at St. George's University, where one of the main goals is actually to build capacity in the region. So one of the things that they have done is reached out to the Ministry of Health. Now, the Ministry of Health in Grenada does something called the School Health Program, where they do a screening of children as they enter primary school and as they enter secondary school. But there's no psychological or neuropsychological component of that. It's more of a general health and dental checkup with the child. So we are aiming to start in a new school term. I'm not sure how that's going to go given how things are currently with COVID-19. But there is an intention to start adding a psychological component, at least now, into that school health program. So what we'll be doing will be going out to test the children. It's going to be some psychological screenings, but there's nothing neuropsychological. There's no neuropsych component in terms of what we can assess. I don't know if anybody here has any contributions to things that might be able to use, because we've been looking and it has been difficult to find something that would fit the bill. That's not a full neuropsych assessment, but something that can give an indication of a need for further assessment in that area.
Maybe we could come back to that towards the end, and if there's any questions, and also just to put out there that there's definitely a need for continued involvement with neuropsychologists in the US to teach and to continue to build this bridges and effort with capacity building in Grenada.
Yes.
So we can finish with that, and thank you. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Kim.
Do I need, okay, no. Okay, it's fine.
I
Thank
was
you.
going to say thank you. Yeah, I definitely hope that we can have a good discussion about this at the end. Thank you, Dr. Blackman and Kemi, for your discussion about the stakeholders and how you've engaged everybody in Grenada as the field of neuropsychology is developing there. And I'd love to hear more about that. And hopefully somebody on our participant list might have a really valuable tool for you guys to include in that screener. So if you have any questions for Dr. Blackman or for Kemi Bergen, please send them to our question and answer box, and we'll talk about them at the end in about 30 minutes or so. So up next, we have Dr. Bryce Mulligan. So Dr. Mulligan is a English and French-speaking neuropsychologist and clinical rehabilitation psychologist at the Ottawa Hospital, which is a public tertiary care teaching hospital located in Canada's federal capital. And it's opposite the Ottawa River from Quebec, which is Canada's major francophone province, and serves regions of Nunavut, which is a northern territory which has a largely predominant Inuit population. So thank you for joining us today, Dr. Mulligan.
Oh, thank you, Josh. It's definitely my pleasure to be here. Similar to our first speaker, I should make maybe not a disclaimer, but a statement of limitations. I'm definitely not an expert in the things I'm going to be presenting. It's very much from my own personal perspective, and I'm going to present a variety of topics, and I can definitely promise to engage with questions on any of the material. I can't promise I'll have all of the answers. So there you go. This is the type of topic that as you get into it, you realize how complex it is. So I thought, considering I don't know my audience and it's international, I'll start with a map of our great nation, Canada, about 152 years old now. And Canada has 10 provinces and 3 territories. The territories are in the north there, Yukon, Northwest, and Nunavut. And so I'm registered in the province of Ontario. And so in Ontario, to call yourself a neuropsychologist, you have to have a doctoral degree. You need 18 months of post-residency supervised practice. You have to write the dreaded EPPP. You need to write a written exam, which we call the JEE, which is a jurisprudence and ethics exam. And you need to go through a final oral examination by 3 of your peers who are registered in Ontario. And I don't know much about registration standards in other provinces, but I do have a colleague registered in Newfoundland, and I verified on their site. So as of last week, this is still their standard. They have a lower bar to register, and it includes registering as a master's level practitioner. So in Ontario, you would have the designation psychological associate with a master's degree, but not psychologist. And basically in Newfoundland, you need a degree and the EPPP to practice psychology. So this just highlights the variety of registration standards in the different provinces. Another interesting aspect of professional psychology in Canada is that we have this thing called the Mutual Recognition Agreement, meaning that CPO, which is the Canadian College of Psychologists of Ontario, the NLPB, which is the Newfoundland and Labrador Psychology Board, all the different provinces have their professional boards or colleges, and they've agreed that once you're registered in a province, there should be few hurdles or barriers to you registering in another province. Generally, that means when you move or when you want to practice in a new province, you would at least need to write the jurisprudence and ethics exam specific to that jurisdiction. So that would have to do with any local laws or reporting mandates, for example. But generally, the recognition agreement is meant to encourage free trade across provincial borders. Can we go to the next slide, please? So here's my public disclosure. This is a web page from the College of Psychologists of Ontario. On the right, this is my public profile. So everyone registered in Ontario has a listing here, which you can find by searching. And you can see there's my name and my business contact where I practice. And you can see I've not disclosed my email to the public. It mentions any limitations on my practice. And then I wanted to call people's attention to the bottom 3 sections. So areas authorized for practice. You can see I'm authorized in 3 areas there: clinical psych, clinical neuropsych, and rehab psych. Now on the left of my slide, you see all the various practice areas recognized by Ontario. And you can see here that in terms of the legal standing of neuropsychology in Ontario, it's seen as a specific area of competence in professional clinical psychology. And generally people are registered in one or two of these areas. It is pretty uncommon to be registered in 3 areas as I am, but because of my training and my sort of career ambitions and my job, I chose to register in all 3, and it was challenging but not difficult to pass that oral exam, or challenging but not impossible. Another key area where you have to declare where you want to be competent is in terms of which client groups you would like to work with. So children, adults, seniors, etc. You can see I'm qualified to work with adults and seniors. And I also am listed as working in both of Canada's official languages, English and French. Next slide, please. So in general, I would say in Canada in general, but it's specifically in Ontario, neuropsychology tends to be well respected, in part because I believe in Ontario the registration standards are rigorous. And so we tend to have a high bar, and so we tend to have quality people working in these positions. And I think that's where our reputation derives from. In terms of how we work with physicians and the health system in general, we have a public-private healthcare model blend sort of in Canada. So basically all persons are eligible and do receive essential medical care. Often psychology is not considered essential, and even if it is, it's not always available through the public stream. So to really coarsely divide neuropsychologists in terms of those that work in public and those that work in private, for example, here at the Ottawa Hospital where I work, we have a lot of people, neuropsychologists, linked to specific programs. For example, first episode psychosis or epilepsy monitoring unit is one of the programs I'm attached to. We also have neuropsychologists that are consultant across multiple units. So for example, I work in acute care, and that means any person admitted to our hospital can be referred for a neuropsych exam, any inpatient. And then I also work in the rehab center, which includes people with spinal cord injury, brain injury, orthopedic injury, respiratory illness, short-term illnesses that require rehabilitation. So really a wide variety of patients and a wide variety of teams and referral streams. Again, generally most people very open to our involvement, and most patients very glad to have us involved as well. In terms of private practice, not an area I know well, having never worked in private practice, but typically referrals would come through primary care, other psychologists, lawyers, insurance companies, as well as specialties similar to in the hospital, from neurology, psychiatry, physiatry, pediatrics, I guess, if you worked in children. Next slide, please. Here's my whiplash tour of the history of, we'll say, Ottawa neuropsychology, because Canada is so broad. You may know it's the second biggest country by land area, and we're very sparsely populated. So there's a lot of sort of seeds, kernels, early incubators of neuropsychology. And so I've chosen to highlight the one that's closest to home. So to me, all neuropsychology begins with the godfather, Luria. And then we fast forward into sort of the US Boston school with Dr. Kaplan in the center of our screens here. And then Donald Stuss on the right, who sadly we just lost last year. Don Stuss was actually born in Sudbury, where I did my bachelor's and master's degrees. And then Don trained in Ottawa and then in Boston with Edith Kaplan and her colleagues, before Don returned to Ottawa in 1978 and basically started the program in neuropsychology here at the Ottawa Hospital in the late 70s and early 80s. And right over on my shelf, I still have Don's Boston Diagnostic stimulus cards from the aphasia exam with his hand scribbled name on them. So this is neuropsychology is a very young discipline, and in Canada, having its roots in the late 70s, early 80s, it's pretty early in the game. So I'm pretty proud to be in the department, working in the house that Don Stuss built, I guess we could say. Next slide, please. The public-private health system, as I've said, kind of complicates service provision in neuropsychology and the development of practice. So a lot of persons don't have coverage for neuropsych or psych services because they're not typically considered essential. And even when they're essential, you have to take it for granted that they're available, and they're often not going to be available in any kind of public accessible sphere. So just to highlight the disparity, here we can see the map of Canada again. You'll notice along that southern US border, you'll see a lot of our biggest cities clustered around that border, and that's no accident. It's a historical, political, infrastructure convenience. But our population is densely concentrated along that 100 kilometers from the US southern border. And so I live in that band in a place called Ottawa. And many people here in Ottawa, in the federal capital, have jobs with the government or other high-paying jobs, and they have benefits that will cover psychology, including private neuropsych services when needed. As a manner of comparison, just north of Ottawa, and I say just, I can use air quotes, you can see me, just north of Ottawa, several thousand kilometers north of us, is a place called Iqaluit in Nunavut. And Iqaluit is the capital of the territory Nunavut, which means our land in Inuit. And you'll see Iqaluit is just shy of the Arctic Circle. There are no roads to get to Iqaluit. You would take boats, trains, planes, helicopters. It's a predominantly majority Inuit population. So these are indigenous Arctic dwelling persons who've been here for thousands of years. And it's in the same healthcare region as Ottawa, if you can believe it. So these people certainly do not have the same access to services as somebody living in Ottawa would, although they do technically have the same right to those services. Me walking down the street to my local psychologist versus someone in Iqaluit flying in a helicopter into Ottawa, obviously there's more barriers there. So my kind of conclusion is that challenges for Canadian neuropsychology are really a part of broader human rights disparities. And I'll kind of leave that very hot potato there, and we'll go to the next slide. So other challenges to Canadian neuropsychology include the fact that we have a very diverse population, and we have many groups represented, but those groups are not of equal size. So we have a lot of very minority groups who are equally in need and equally deserving of service. So one of the downfalls to having such a diverse population is that we tend to lean on other countries with similar subpopulations. So we often will employ US tests or US norms, or tests from the UK, or tests from France for our French-speaking persons, but this is not always appropriate. A good example is the French WIMS-3, and I'm laughing because the content of the WIMS-3 is so not even French, but Parisian French. And if you know anything about the French culture and the French language, you'll appreciate that not every French-speaking person speaks Parisian by a long shot. And so a lot of our working class Quebec population or Francophone Ontario population would not have the same cultural references or phrasing in their speech as they would find in say, the logical memory for French-speaking people from WIMS-3. There's also a lot of variation among English-speaking Canadians, as I've said. And even within the French-speaking population, there's huge variety. Within Quebec, there are various subpopulations and regions and dialects. There are people known as Franco-Ontarians, which are French-speaking Ontario people. There's French people from France. There's French-speaking people from the Caribbean. There's French-speaking people from Africa, et cetera, et cetera. In addition, there's almost a total lack of tests that are appropriate for Indigenous persons, especially those who have an isolated, rural, remote community experience where they're not going to have the same cultural milieu, they're not going to have the same vocabulary. A partial exception to this rule is the MOCA 8.1 for Vancouver Island Coastal First Nations. So where our final speaker, Dr. Garcia Barrera, works at University of Victoria, is also where I did my PhD, and that is located on Vancouver Island. And the MOCA, someone created a MOCA with naming items and verbal recall items that are appropriate to that Vancouver Island region First Nation. Next slide, please. I think it's my last. So in very quick summary here, The cultural and linguistic variation in French-speaking people has actually, although it's been a challenge, has also driven innovation. So many people across Canada and Quebec have developed locally normed instruments. So it's not always the best solution, but it's practical. So here in Ottawa, at the Ottawa Hospital, we have a R-bands that's been translated in-house by bilingual people, and it's written in language that's appropriate to this region, the Ottawa-Gatineau region, which spans Ottawa, Ontario, and the French-speaking province of Quebec. Personally, as an primarily English-speaking person, it was very shocking to suddenly do neuropsychology in a second language, and I'd be curious to hear from more of the speakers about the challenges. For me, it was very humbling and continues to be very humbling to work in a second language where I'm used to having very high standards for my fluency and my expression and my vocabulary. And as you know, there's a lot of technical words and jargon in neuropsychology, and having to adapt to a more common parlance, I guess. It's a hit to the ego, and it picks up executive skills. When you're trying to use them all for testing and you need to translate, it can be a challenge. Also, very, very quickly, I'd be remiss if I did not mention the fact that in Canada, we have a lot of people who've been traumatized by history and politics, including Indigenous people who were forced from their homes and educated in schools run by the government and by churches. We have a colonial history in Canada. As recent as World War II, we kept people, including Japanese and Ukrainian people, in camps in semi-prison conditions. And so some of the people in Canada that need psychology and neuropsychology the most are also maybe less likely to trust us. So my very last point is we do need neuropsychologists from underrepresented groups in Canada, and we need something like a culture fair, something like a universal language tool that's deployable by telehealth. So my patient in Iqaluit does not have to fly in a helicopter for me to screen their cognition. So thank you for sticking with me through the whirlwind. I hope there are some questions because I opened a lot of cans of worms.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Mulligan. I think that was a really helpful presentation. And it's great to hear, I know so many of our panelists today, many of them are bilingual, and I think that's a huge issue and a growing area of need in our field around the world. So it's great to hear from all of you. So our final speaker today, and if you have any questions actually for Dr. Mulligan, we're going to do them, all the questions and answers right after Dr. Garcia Barrera talks. But our final panelist is Dr. Mauricio Garcia Berneda, who is a native of Medellin, Colombia, though he immigrated to the United States in 2002 to obtain his master's and PhD in psychology at the University of Georgia. He's now an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Victoria in British Columbia, Canada, which he joined in 2008, and he created the Cortex Lab, which largely studies the neural and behavioral foundations of executive functioning. Dr. Garcia Berneda is the president of the Latin American Association of Neuropsychology, and his research focuses on the study of executive functioning with a particular interest in clinical events or environmental variables that modify the lifespan development of this self-regulatory capacity. He will be speaking to us today about a comparative review of neuropsychology across countries in northern, central, and southern Latin America. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Garcia Barrera.
Thank you so much, Josh. And thank you everyone that is attending this webinar. I really appreciate the invitation by the organizers of Know Neuropsychology. You know, this is a great opportunity to socialize like how neuropsychology looks like around different places in the world. So as mentioned by Josh, I am located in Canada, but I am going to be talking mostly about my experiences working with Latin America and in the training and development of neuropsychology in Latin America. I may try to be brief so that we have enough time to discuss all the questions. So when we talk about Latin America, very similar to what has been mentioned before in other settings, like Europe, it's large. Canada is very broad, very variable in the regionalizations and languages. Similarly with Latin America, we are talking about a compound of around 20 different countries and 14 different dependencies and several languages. So the richness of multicultural diversity, it's very big. So it's very difficult to kind of like speak in a few minutes about this wealth. But I want to kind of like concentrate a little bit in some of the extremes within this big area that is in the screen in green that we call Latin America. So Josh, if you do a click, we have here, I am pointing out some of the countries that I am the closest more related to, given the relationships that I have through my research, but also through my association with the ALAN, the Latin American Association of Neuropsychology. So I'll be mostly speaking about Mexico, Guatemala, Colombia, and Argentina, although it's very similar across Latin America. So I will make a point of like bringing the attention to everything that is shared by these nations. Next slide, please. Thank you, Josh. So I was asked the question for this panel, what is the path to become a neuropsychologist in Latin America? And there is a lot of diversity between the different countries, but there is also some things in common that are shared. So this graph will represent a little bit of those common aspects. Most of the people that are interested in pursuing a career in neuropsychology start with a bachelor's in psychology. In Latin America, more often, this bachelor, it's about 4 to 5 years, and it includes oftentimes a research project at the end of it, and also a clinical practice. And this is required because it's the only requirement in order to become a licensed psychologist in most of the countries in Latin America, I would say all of them. However, if you want to pursue a career in neuropsychology, you are now looking into obtaining a master's degree in most of the countries. So there are exceptions, and the breadth of Latin America kind of like brings so many possibilities. But most countries, including those that I'm trying to exemplify, like Mexico, Guatemala, Colombia, and Argentina, are starting to require another level of a specialization. That is the graduate level. Master's is the only requirement. This is a requirement in order to self-nominate in your practice as a neuropsychologist. But granted, there are no accreditation bodies or certification bodies that will actually give you a title or a certification that you are indeed trained to be practicing as a clinical neuropsychologist. In some countries, like in Argentina, you can graduate from a bachelor's in medicine or in speech language pathology and other areas, and be able to perform a career as a neuropsychologist, given that ethically you have received some appropriate training through other means. Doctoral degree is no requirement in any of the countries of Latin America, and there are efforts in developing more and more programs, but there are very few. Like just one in Colombia got approved and is going to start the very first cohort this July. So they are hoping to have a small cohort of trainees that have a master's and are going to be moving into the doctoral degree. There are a few in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and there is a couple in Mexico, but mostly under the psychobiology and neuroscience area. They may have faculty that are clinical neuropsychologists, so they have a little bit of a fusion of that topic, but it's not required. And a survey that was performed in the 2014 by colleagues from Deusto, from Dr. Ojeda's institution, demonstrated that actually roughly about 75%, so 3/4 of practicing clinical neuropsychologists in Latin America have completed a graduate degree. So they all have no access to this kind of level of specialization. Next slide. I was also asked, like, what resources the trainees can access in order to specialize in Latin America in neuropsychology. So there are organizations like the association that I represent, the ALAN, but also the SLAD, Sociedad Latinoamericana de Neuropsicología, and many others. I named there the association from Brazil called Sociedade Brasileira de Neuropsicologia, that have been making large efforts in socializing, in doing knowledge translation, knowledge mobilization of content, mostly from research studies in Latin America, but also outside, and through the creation of conferences, meetings. Right now, there are efforts to produce webinars, much more like these, but also a big congress that usually happen about 2 years, every 2 years. So in those events, like in any other event, there's interest in socializing not only research, but also basic training, like courses in neuroanatomy, assessment, rehabilitation, and like the cutting edge of technology and tools that we use in the field. INS has also been involved in kind of like making stronger bridges and connections with Latin America societies, And that has helped quite a bit in training of Latin American neuropsychologists in the most recent years. There are some societies in every country. Every country has at least one, if not more, societies, and they have their own conferences and congress, more local, that also sometimes facilitate the training through a specialized speaker series or a particular guest. And there are always continuing education courses that people can access, mostly through internet or traveling to different regions, and mostly main cities like Mexico City, Buenos Aires, Bogota, Medellin in Colombia, and through those, they're able to specialize their training. Next slide, please. Neuropsychology is very similar to what has been spoken before, have roles that are shared commonly across the world. In Latin America in particularly, most of them work in private practice. There is no recognition in the public sector by the governments, by the hospitals that are publicly funded to actually have neuropsychologists in place. So most of the hiring force are private practices, either clinics or neuropsychologists setting up their own private practices. And academic settings, it seems to be another front force for the hiring of neuropsychologists. Around 20% of the neuropsychologists that have completed surveys in Latin America say that they work for universities, actually like a lecturer, sessionals, teaching some courses, or doing supervisions. But those that work in hospitals are quite small proportion, about 15%, and most of them do not work full-time. They work part-time, so they complement with different positions. Very similar to US and the Canada kind of like settings, we work a lot from referrals, from neurologists, psychologists, psychiatrists, school systems, self-referrals, and oftentimes they are seeking assessment for diagnosis, but also individual therapy out in and out the context of neuro rehab. More and more, there is interest in working with neurodevelopmental, neurodegenerative disorders like dementia, ADHD, but also rehab after acquired brain injury like strokes. Traumatic brain injury is a growing interest as well. We can move to the next slide. So in order to put a little bit of context about the present and the future, it's always good to remember a little bit the roots. I could speak for the whole 15 minutes just about this one slide, so I recommend those interested this very good article, Neuropsychology in Latin America, written by a former president of the ALANT, a great mentor for me, Dr. Alfredo Ardila. He has written extensively about the history and the state of the art of neuropsychology in Latin America. And this article captures quite well those early years. But in a nutshell, I'll try to take a minute here. We can say that neuropsychology has very similar roots to those that are shared across the world, but it started in Latin America at the heart of South America in Uruguay. There was interest in the mid-50s, particularly towards the end of that decade, by Dr. Carlos and Celica Mendilaharzu to bring neuropsychology to the world of neurology in Uruguay. So they created a lab called the Brain Dysfunctions Lab within a neurological institute in Montevideo, and started bringing research and speakers and a little bit of training that allow for neuropsychology to be seated. But after that got picked up around Latin America, particularly Mexico, Colombia, and Argentina, Peru as well, Brazil. There's so much about Brazil that I cannot cover. But different associations, different events took place in these countries that allow for specialized training for people to come from abroad and get together and have meetings. For instance, in Mexico, there was a large meeting and a lot of visitors to the Universidad Autónoma de Mexico, the UNAM, that brought like Hekine and Brenda Milner and Glasgow and Arthur Benton, like all the big names of neuropsychology in the world to the table. And with that, we seeded quite a strong trunk and roots to the development of neuropsychology in Latin America. But in the 70s, a big contribution was the translation of all the works by Alexander Romanovich Luria that was mentioned by Bryce Mulligan. So as Dr. Mulligan mentioned, he's like the grandfather of neuropsychology, and we're very influenced by the teachings of Luria in Latin America. So that was really important because those works that were written in Russian were not translated at the same rate as the works by Europeans and French and other researchers in neuropsychology. Another pivotal year was in 1983. The International Neuropsychological Society hosted in Latin America and Mexico, the INS meeting, the annual meeting. So that was big to congregate people from Latin America and also from North America and like share a little bit what things were going, looking like. And between 1989 and 1999, the two major associations of neuropsychology in Latin America got formed. And after that, there has been so many collaborations and efforts to create masters and doctoral programs, but they have been crystallized slow, given that the lack of recognition. And in 2015, there was a master's degree that was accepted in Guatemala to represent pretty much Central America. So I kind of like wanted to highlight that because it's one of the most recent achievements in that area. And I think that Dr. Ted Jall is attending this meeting today. And he has been heavily involved in the development of that program in Guatemala. Next slide. So we have a lot of challenges. I don't have to go into a lot of detail in this slide because they have been mentioned by my colleagues before. There is lack of access to training. There are not a lot of programs. We can count programs in a couple of hands, unlike in North America or Canada. So it's very limited. There is no regulation of the discipline. There is no accreditation. There is no EPPP or jury, making sure that you have the skill sets to perform as a neuropsychologist. And because of that, we also don't have a lot of recognition in the medical settings. So oftentimes they may refer and people have to pay private clinicians to get an assessment done. So it's very costly, and that offers a big restriction of who can access these services. There is also very limited funding for research. So knowledge mobilization, translation, it's growing, there are opportunities there, but there is not a lot of support in terms of resources. So it's hard to get that specialized knowledge and to share neuropsychology with our trainees in Latin America. And as has been mentioned before, we have very limited tools. There's no access to technical manuals, lots of photocopying, and creating their own kind of tests. There is not a lot of support to publish peer-reviewed papers in English so that they can be socialized with the world. So a lot of the wonderful research that is being originated and conducted in Latin America is not known in the rest of the world because it's being published in local journals, university journals in Spanish, and they don't have the breadth of the audience that other journals will have. Next slide. So with those challenges, there is also opportunities, and I have just the last two slides. So some of those challenges are going to be the test development. We don't have a lot of interest and support from companies to develop tests that are embedded within Latin America. So there are a few examples of tests that are being built and are being socialized and published, like there's one called the ENI that specializes in the assessment of cognition in early development. There is one that is from Argentina called the NECO frontal screening that specializes in frontal and executive dysfunctions, particularly in dementia. And tests like that have been developed thinking about cultural appropriate approaches to norms and to standardization of the tests, rather than just the translation of the tests. But there is lots of research in cross-cultural psychology showing that when we translate a test and we use norms that are not necessarily the local norms, there could be issues with that. And one of my former students, Dr. Emily Dugan, now at Johns Hopkins, did quite a lot of work in Colombia, looking at how using norms from other countries can really affect the decision-making process of psychologists and neuropsychologists in looking at the test scores. So a scarcity of tools, a lot of the difficulties that have been mentioned before with translation to different languages, and that idea that one size fits all, that doesn't really work, because we're using a lot of tests in Latin America that have been developed the norm in Spain and in Mexico, but they are not appropriate in regions of Uruguay, Bolivia, Argentina, Colombia, and lots of variability in that regard. Next slide. We have also opportunities. So there's a great growing effort in developing more culturally relevant tools, having norms that are more appropriate for Latin America. There are journals that have been producing a lot of publications of research, like the Revista de Neuropsicología, Neuropsiquiatría, Neurociencias, that is sponsored by the LAN, and the journal Neuropsicología Latinoamericana, that is sponsored by SLAN. Those are the free access online, and lots of publications there of the research that is being conducted within Latin America. There are many others that I cannot name, but also we're working in establishing stronger relationships with our counterparts in the world. So with INS, we recently signed an agreement, and I'm right there in one of the photographs in the corner, signing this agreement with Dr. Vicky Anderson. We were in Brazil last year in the INS meeting, and we have a little bit of an agreement to work together towards the mobilization of knowledge and facilitation of training in neuropsychology in Latin America. And the SLAN and the ALAN are also trying to work together to pursue this goal. One important feature is that a lot of neuropsychologists from Colombia and Argentina, Mexico, Guatemala, and other countries are being trained elsewhere in Canada, in the States, in Europe, and they're starting to focus their interest and the research and their clinical practice in Latin America. So with that has been, I think that has seeded the ground for lots of growth and development of the field in our countries. And I think that this is my last slide. So I felt like I rushed a little bit, but I also have so much to share, so many countries involved in Latin America. But thank you again for this invitation. And with no further ado, we have a few minutes left for at least a couple of questions. So thank you. Thank you, Josh.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Garcia. I feel like we covered a lot of ground today, and I'm really thrilled for how much we've learned collectively today. I should have mentioned at the beginning of the talk that we're hoping to have this type of panel be sort of a featured and recurring or returning part of our series. So in the future, we're hoping to feature perspectives from Australia, Africa, and Asia as well in the coming time. I'm just gonna look at the questions right now that we got. I think we have time for maybe like 2 questions. So let's see. Okay, so this is one question that we got. So in the United States, there is a move to create cross-jurisdiction licensure like Dr. Ojeda was discussing within Europe. Do any of the panelists foresee this being done in their regions, like, for example, cross-jurisdiction in Canada, cross-jurisdiction in Latin America? And do you feel like it's happening soon or later in terms of this endeavor for cross-jurisdiction licensure?
I can just briefly again highlight, in Canada, we do have the recognition agreement. And so although you can't register for a Canada-wide license, you can get registered in a province and then easily register or more easily register in any of the other provinces after that.
All right.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I was just gonna say that I can maybe speak a little bit for the Caribbean. And well, and this is not supposed to be English speaking Caribbean only. It is supposed to be, there's an organization called CANPA, which is the Caribbean Alliance of National Psychological Associations. And currently we don't have any particular licensing policy for psychology in the Caribbean, but that is a group that is working on doing something. And what they want to do is actually come up with a regional agreement for licensure. So that when that is completed, that will look at having the entire Caribbean under that one umbrella. But we don't have anything just yet.
Awesome, thank you. I think another great question that just came up too that I'm seeing that I think is actually really relevant to the whole world, especially areas that are highly multilingual, is, are there any specific language standards or guidelines for practicing clinically if you're working in a second language? For example, in Canada, if you're a native English speaker, but you need to pass, do you need to pass like a certain French test, or are there certain ethics for practicing in your second language or a third language?
I personally think this is a bit of a blind spot for our profession. Although I can say when I was in the interview process to get my job, this is my first job out of training, I was quite shocked that after all the hurdles and all the education, that me getting this job came down to, yes, a French language exam, because the way my position was funded, French was a requirement. And so I found myself dusting off my high school French skills and going to a test center and engaging in a naturalistic French conversation. And I was not at all prepared for that eventuality. I'm certainly glad it worked out, but I do think I think you mentioned, Josh, it's an area where in the future it's going to make us, I hate the term, but it's going to make us more marketable and it makes us more ethical, in my opinion. When I can deliver services in a patient's primary language and my secondary language, I prefer to do that whenever possible.
And it's not just language, it's also cultural idioms. I found that in the Caribbean, it would be impossible for me to administer a neurodevelopmental test battery to children and for them to understand me, even though it's English, and for me to understand them. So we had to work with students or professionals in the area, and licensure in the Caribbean actually is taking that into account. So if someone comes from another country to practice there, they have to work for a certain amount of time with a regional psychologist, and it doesn't matter how many years of training or experience you have to understand the culture before you can become licensed in that region.
I'm curious if Dr. Ojedo's still, I think she's still with us, what her thoughts are on this too in Spain, given your proximity to northern parts of Africa and so many other countries in Europe as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's really challenging, actually. As I said, I'm bilingual in one other official language in Spain, but still, you know, I don't feel so comfortable when speaking to a patient who is whose mother language is Basque, for example, because there are not only language issues. For me, the more challenging part is connecting with the emotional part that is sometimes associated to language and to context. And, you know, that's something that is really missing when I am I feel more like a translator. I'm not a very good translator because I'm not including that part. Also, you know, it is not the case in Canada because we are talking about French and English. But in the case of Spain, we are talking about official languages, not dialects, but official languages. But we don't have neuropsych materials that have been created or well translated into those languages. So it is the case for Basque. I know just one exception with the Catalan language, where a couple of tests for adults and one test for childhood are available, but you know, that's really limited. So in any case, I think we all feel not that comfortable when trying to face situations like that. And I think the only way I've been able to kind of solve it somehow is just being very prudent about my conclusions and about the information I provide, and highlight always the limitations that I had when facing that assessment. Because we have to keep in mind that the life of people is there, and the diagnosis or the prognosis that you are going to be putting down on a report and signing is going to maybe change that person's life. In Spain, that will be the case for like, just to give you two quick examples, if the person is going to be able to access to be covered by the public system in terms of rehabilitation or not, depending on the diagnosis. Or like, for example, when someone is in between mild cognitive impairment or early phases of dementia, scores, very small score changes could fit either one or the other. So, there are consequences on those, and we just, as students and as professionals, we have to keep that in mind and be very prudent with the conclusions.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your perspective. I just want to be cognizant of time. I feel like this discussion could go on for a long time. You all are really interesting presenters, and I feel like I've learned a lot today. Hopefully all of our attendees or whoever watches a recording of this lecture will feel like they've learned a lot as well. So thank you to our panelists again, and thank you everyone for attending. One note, as a lot of you might know, is this is our last lecture in our first round of 12 lectures. So Know Neuropsychology is excited to be coming back for another round of 12 lectures starting in September. So just stay tuned on Twitter, email, however you stay in touch with us, be sure to stay tuned. And everyone who's registered for our mailing list will also be getting a post-series evaluation survey in their email. So please take it at your soonest convenience, since this will help us plan for the upcoming year. Thanks so much, everybody, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. And thank you to our speakers again.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you.